morning, everyone. My name is Pete Canlon, Executive Director of the American Kratom Association. I'd like to welcome everyone to our press briefing today. We'll be discussing the submission of the over 50,000 comments to the FDA opposing an international ban on kratom and providing an update on the lawsuit we filed against FDA and HHS to extend the public comment period. We have several reporters who have submitted questions via email that we will address at the end of the call. If you'd like to submit a question before then, please email me at pete@americankratom.org, or you can press the Q&A button. This morning, I'm joined by Mac Haddo, Senior Fellow on Public Policy at the American Kratom Association. Mac has been involved in government relations activities since 1986, when he left his position as Chief of Staff at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to go into the private sector. Mac has worked with the AKA since 2016. So without any further delay, Mac, I will turn the time over to you.
Thank you, Pete, and welcome to all of those who have joined this call. Just by way of background, where this issue actually arose, the latest in what we think is a very hostile action by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration really occurred when the World Health Organization officially provided notice to the U.S. government through the Department of State on June 10th of 2021 that kratom and its alkaloids, metrogynine and 7-hydroxymetrogynine, among 6 other substances, were the subject of a pre-review with the Expert Committee on Drug Dependence at the WHO. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration inexplicably waited 42 days after the receipt of the official notice to request comments on the substances that were listed in the WHO notice. We can't understand that. Obviously, if the FDA were interested in hearing the comments so that they could review them as a part of their presentation to the WHO, you would have thought that they would have immediately opened a comment period that would allow for Americans to formulate the specific comments and recommendations they would make, including scientists who have been heavily involved in this research. But the FDA decided not to do that. They published their notice on July 22nd. They then called for a end time of August the 9th, 2021, which was at 11:59 p.m. last night. Our effort to try to convince the FDA to extend that comment period when it was heard in the hearing yesterday was unsuccessful with the judge, but we were encouraged that in the course of the public record that was established, that the court was aware of some of these problems that we see and the hostility that was evidenced in the regulatory actions taken by the FDA with regard to this comment period. I was told by an FDA official when I inquired as to why there was such a short length of time for comments to be submitted by the public and scientists and interested stakeholders, the explanation was that they were bound by a WHO time limit, and that's why they had to end the time on August the 9th, because the next day, today, was the date of submissions. That seems odd if you're going to have a comment period at all, that you would have waited until July 23rd, 42 days after receipt of it, shorten that time period, and then say you're going to hand over your response to the WHO on August the 10th. What possible period of time would you have to review those comments that were submitted if you set that deadline? I don't think that that made much sense to the court either, but in any event, it now appears that the FDA is willing to consider extending in a reopened comment period for comments to be received until August the 23rd or 24th, based on, by their representation, an extension that the World Health Organization has provided, that presentations are now due on August the 27th. And that being the case, we hope that the FDA will reopen their comment period. What we have done at the American Kratom Association with 2 things. One is we encouraged all of the public comments to go through a portal that we established that we call protectkratom.org. Because the second thing that the FDA official said was that the reason that they'd have to worry too much about the evaluation of the comments was that the statute in the United States requires that the FDA gather comments and that they consider them. They are not bound in any way legally to submit those comments individually to the World Health Organization. So we believe that as a part of this comment process, that you have to get a sense of the passion and the individual experiences of kratom consumers to understand how important it has been in terms of their health and well-being and the uses for which they put the kratom, which is their First Amendment right to do so. When you hear these comments and you hear over and over again people saying that kratom has saved their lives, restored them into being productive citizens where they can be good family members, they can have social networks that are rational, where they're able to go back to work, where they're able to maintain the kinds of social relationships that are essential to the health and well-being of any family. When you hear those stories, you hear individual stories about people who claim that the addiction cycle was broken by kratom. And that's, of course, validated by the Johns Hopkins study that is peer-reviewed and published that indicates that 87% of adults who use kratom in order to wean off of opioids found relief from withdrawal symptoms by using kratom. And secondly, the conclusion was that 35% were opioid-free within a year by using kratom. From a harm reduction standpoint, that's a powerful statement. We want the World Health Organization and the expert committee to hear those stories. So our plan is to submit every one of the comments. To date, the combination of the efforts by the American Kratom Association, we have about 50,000 comments, and about 45,000 comments, and the FDA has about 8,000. So we're well over the 50,000 comment threshold, and we expect that number to be much greater because irrespective of what the FDA chooses to do, we are going to keep that comment portal open, and we're going to continue to gather comments from U.S. citizens to be able to express their views to the World Health Organization about why the FDA is wrong on this policy, wrong on the science. And that's clearly been evidenced as we have looked at the growth in the science and the peer-reviewed published articles that address the kratom issue that have occurred since the August 16th, 2018 rescission letter that Dr. Zawah, then the Assistant Secretary for Health at HHS, in his formal rescission letter from withdrawing the FDA's recommendation for the scheduling of kratom, when he said that even in 2018, that the emerging science contradicted the FDA's position on kratom. And since then, we've had more than 100 new studies that have documented the safety profile of kratom and the reasons why it should be regulated properly and not banned. And we think that will be persuasive to the expert committee at the World Health Organization as well. So our view of all of this is that in order for the right public health policy to be determined, not only in the United States, but also in the world, that the WHO expert committee should hear these comments and review the ability, in fact, review scientific comments, because many scientists have also expressed their opposition to the FDA's position, and hopefully that will influence the WHO as they conduct their pre-review. It's our understanding that on October the 11th, and then they proceed for a couple of days of deliberations, the WHO expert committee will make a decision about whether they go to a full critical review, which could last a year. And after that, if they were then to determine that kratom should be eligible for scheduling, they would make that recommendation to the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs. We will, throughout that process, hope to educate and inform each one of these policymakers about the true character of kratom, why it is not why the FDA's position is incorrect with respect to its characterization as an opioid or an opioid-like substance, why the pharmacologic action that the FDA claims takes place is not true, why the science proves that you don't get the reinforcing euphoric high from kratom that is the signature of opioids and they're dangerous, why kratom does not impact the respiratory system where you get most drug overdose deaths because the victims literally suffocate. That doesn't happen with kratom, and why all of the evidence with respect to the safety profile is really derivative of adulterated kratom products that should not be on the marketplace if the FDA were doing their job. You look at the history of safety of kratom in Southeast Asia, where it's been used for centuries, and you see the recognition of other governments like Thailand who have reversed their previous policy on kratom. That's what the FDA should be looking at, rather than continuing to falsely tout the fact that Thailand has banned kratom. Effective today, as of today, that's not true. And as of August 24th, not only is kratom totally legal as a medicinal plant in Thailand, they've opened it up for growing. And my understanding is that on August 24th, there'll be a smart farming program implemented in Thailand, allowing for plantations of kratom plants to be grown, harvested, cultivated, and exported to customers around the world. So we are hoping in the end of this process that the FDA will not only act appropriately with respect to the gathering of comments and allow the World Health Committee expert committee to review it, but they themselves will do an internal review of their hostile policy towards kratom, and that we can come to a good public policy that allows for properly regulated kratom plants free from contaminants and adulterants to be available to the American people for the benefits that this plant can provide. So I'll end with that and turn it back to you, Pete, for any questions that anyone might have.
Yes, thank you very much, Mac, for the update. We have several questions that have been submitted online. I first wanted to give any folks on the call an opportunity to ask any questions first before I go into the ones that were submitted online. So do we have anyone on the call who would like to ask a question right now? Okay, we'll go to the submitted questions. We've got 5 questions that were submitted. First one, what was the FDA's opposition to extending the comment period?
So the FDA justified their position to the court, as I understand it, saying that they themselves didn't feel that there was any obligation, nor did they have proper notice about the publication of the comment period until they actually published in the Federal Register. They didn't explain in any way why they waited 42 days, but that's something that was left in the void. But their justification for limiting the comment period was, as I stated, their belief that the WHO expected to have the submission from the FDA on August the 10th. I've spoken with WHO officials and I could not confirm that. Always it was a date at the latter part of August that we've been told when we have to have our submissions in. I don't know why the FDA would be under any other standard or deadline. I don't think that, from my perspective, they were, but they claimed that they were told that they had a deadline of August the 10th, which is why they cut off comments on August the 9th. So we expect that now that that deadline has been relaxed, that they should reopen the comment period. We're hopeful they'll do so in the latter part of this week, so that people can continue to comment online if they choose to do so directly to the FDA.
Okay. Second question, is the AKA working with any other groups or other countries to build opposition to the potential international ban?
So in the United States, we've reached out to a number of allies and stakeholders in the drug policy community and informed them, and they have been helping not only weigh in with the WHO, but also to weigh into the FDA, opposing the hostile position that the FDA has taken on kratom, and really encourage, just as the National Institute on Drug Abuse has done, to study this plant, to determine what the precise safety profile is, to make a determination about what the addiction liability is, because NIDA's research, peer-reviewed and published, contradicts completely the FDA's position on addiction liability. That's a key part of the scheduling recommendation, both here in the United States and at the WHO. We know that the safety studies that have been done contradict directly the FDA's original position that kratom causes deaths. Now they call them kratom-associated deaths. And the only thing that means is that they have detected kratom in the tox screens of deceased individuals, nothing to do with what the toxicity levels of metrogenine are. Only the FDA's encouragement that medical examiners mislabel those deaths as metrogenine intoxication. So we're working with other groups to do that on an international level. We've reached out to other countries, and we're working currently with individuals in Indonesia, where there's a significant economic stake. And a recent Indonesian study by the Department of Ministry of Health in Indonesia concludes the significant adverse economic impact on the growing regions with low-income families from a kratom ban. They also identify that there are 44 million kratom trees that are under cultivation in Indonesia that would have to be destroyed by Indonesian law if there were an international ban. And when you look at the implications that has for climate change, you would think that the WHO would pay attention to that. We're also working with Thailand because obviously Thailand, having just changed their laws, has a significant stake in maintaining the policy position that they've taken. We're talking with people in Cambodia, Laos, in Philippines, in Malaysia, and we're talking with government officials in the European Union, because at the end of the day, all of those countries have a stake in this issue, not only from the concern about drug overdoses and the potential benefits the kratom plant can have in solving some of that problem, but also the freedom that individuals should have in order to make choices about their own health and well-being. And as long as it is properly regulated so that it's not contaminated and not adulterated, Kratom is a safe plant. So we're working with all of those stakeholders to get them to weigh into the WHO expert committee, and if necessary, to weigh in with the UN Commissioner on Narcotic Drugs that ultimately would make any decision about banning Kratom internationally under the 1971 convention.
Thank you, Mac. And I get this question quite a bit over the last couple of weeks. Is there any data that the FDA is referencing that shows that there should be an international ban on Kratom? I mean, what's the justification? I know here in the United States, they've pointed to several supposed Kratom-associated deaths, many of which are polydrug use or other causes of death. Is there some data point that they're pointing to that would as a reference point that shows that there needs to be an international ban on Kratom?
The criteria for banning in the United States is very similar to the criteria for the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs to issue a ban internationally. The FDA has been unsuccessful now in 2 attempts to have Kratom listed as a Schedule I substance under the Controlled Substances Act. The first one in 2016, when they used the narrow emergency power section of the Controlled Substances Act, where they only had to prove 3 factors of the 8 that typically are under review. And the DEA withdrew that one, as everyone knows, open for public comment, for which there were 23,232 comments of Kratom consumers, 99.1% of which were against the ban. And of course, there was an 8-factor analysis, which was a full comprehensive literature review, which the FDA should have produced, but did not. That was done by Jack Henningfield of Pinney and Associates. And that became the document of reference for the DEA until October 16th of 2017, when the FDA submitted their own 8-factor analysis. We have only seen a part of that 8-factor analysis. When it was disclosed by the FDA to a FOIA request, the clerk only ran the scan on one side of a 2-page document, but the scientists reviewed what they had available and determined that it was a disappointingly poor evidence, which was reiterated by Dr. Joie in his letter of August 16, 2018, when he characterized the entire report as based on disappointingly poor evidence and data. That's the problem that the FDA has. They excluded evidence that it clearly was exculpatory, that weighed against their recommendation, that is peer-reviewed and published. That is against what the 8 factors analysis was supposed to do. They're supposed to publish all literature, pro and con, and you would think an agency that has the mission statement of protecting the public health would adhere to that standard, but instead they tainted the 8-factor analysis to only talk about the negative information, and that negative information was viewed by Dr. Joie as being disappointingly poor evidence and data. That's the standard. So the new 8-factor analysis that is now in the final stages of completion, and everyone will see probably this week, references more than 100 new studies that have been conducted since 2018, all of which argue for more research for the benefits, documenting the evidence that this plant has for having specific benefits to individuals. This is the kind of policy argument that we want to make to the WHO, because clearly the evidence that is being accumulated today is stronger than it was in 2018, and the FDA has added nothing to the scientific evidence database since then. They did announce that they were going to have a dose finding study and a human abuse potential study a couple of weeks ago. But it is seriously flawed, because they say that they get to dictate what the protocol is, and more importantly, they get to own the data and it will not be publicly released, which eliminates most of the qualified academic institutions in America who will not participate in that study because they are restricted in disclosure of the data. It is unexplainable why the FDA would restrict taxpayer-funded research. We ought to be fully transparent. If it's bad for us, we'll live with it. We want science to dictate this policy, but the FDA wants to hide the ball. They say, and when they were questioned by academic institutions as to why they would put that kind of restriction on it, they said, because we're paying for it. No, they are not. The American people are paying for it. We believe in transparency, and I cannot imagine that restriction is going to be allowed to stand, but they put it in there because it appears that they have already selected who their contract research organization is going to be. They're going to cook the protocol and they're going to get the result they want. And so we'll probably see them publish it in a couple of years, but it will be badly tainted because of the process that they've adopted. And if they don't get the result they want, then they'll bury it, we'll never see the light of day. That's not what taxpayer funded research should be about.
Absolutely, absolutely. Another question that we have, and you touched on this, is there any new research that has been published or about to be published that examines the safety of kratom?
Yes, the avalanche of research that's been done in the last 2 years all points to the safety factors that are involved here. And some of the issues are, one, the addiction liability. That is conclusive now when you look at the addiction liability studies done with gold standard animal tests funded by the National Institutes on Drug Abuse, which is why Dr. Volko, the director of NIDA, testified before Congress that we should continue to do this important research because of the reports that they are receiving that are consistent with the Johns Hopkins study, that people are successfully weaning off of opioids and replacing opioids in the management of acute and chronic pain. And when you look at Dr. Zawah's point that millions of Americans are put at risk if you ban this substance because you force them from a natural product that is helping them manage acute and chronic pain onto far more dangerous drugs that we know the safety profile of those. So it's a relative issue in that standpoint. But you will see dramatic studies over the next couple of months that will be released in peer-reviewed studies which show that the kratom is indeed safe. And look at the most recent study published by Dr. McCurdy under a NIDA-funded grant, where he looked at what's called lyophilized kratom tea and analyzed whether it is an effective product that can be used as an alternative to opioids. He concluded that it was, and that there is no significant addiction liability associated with it. That's the key here, is that people are not dying. Their lives are being saved by using kratom if they choose to use that and if they find it to be effective. The FDA should allow science to dictate this policy, not their hubris from what is a heavily biased position that they adopted back in 2012 when they concluded that the research on the 9 deaths in Sweden that occurred in a 12-month period from a single product, which appropriately got their attention, but what they ignored when they imposed their import alerts on kratom was the research, peer-reviewed and published, the Kronstadt report that found that all 9 of those deaths were actually the result of an adulterant that was added to that product with O-desmethyltramadol, at which likely would have caused the deaths of anyone who had consumed that dosage of O-desmethyltramadol in a cup of coffee or glass of orange juice. So the FDA has been wrong on the science from the get-go. They just won't acknowledge the error, and they continue to double down on their anti-kratom position. We want them to recognize science as being the basis for all of their regulatory decisions.
Excellent, thank you. We've got a question here from Malcolm. Malcolm, I just invited you to unmute. Malcolm, do you have any questions that you'd like to ask Mac?
Hey, thanks very much, Peter. Yes, and thank you, Mac. As we touched base before, when FDA, published the notice for comment on the WHO request, do you think that there was some contact from FDA to convince WHO to consider kratom for the UN schedule?
Well, we have no way of confirming that yet. We hope that through various tools that are available to us, we can discover who actually made the recommendation. Under the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs protocols for opening up pre-reviews, which are handled by the WHO, any member country can request it. We're aware of a discussion that took place 2 years ago at the UN Commission meetings about kratom, and there was a specific discussion about studies that have been done in the Philippines for which they found no significant problem and no public health threat. And then Malaysia Singapore had made a comment in a meeting that they were concerned about kratom based on the FDA's talking points. And so I don't think it's unreasonable for anyone to conclude that the FDA's persistent anti-kratom messaging, which they have been touting not only here in the United States, but in various international meetings, likely led to the decision by the WHO to open up a pre-review on kratom. But I emphasize this, the FDA's narrative is not consistent with the science. It's not consistent with the safety protocols that are in place to evaluate these kinds of substances. And I think that when we're able to educate the expert committee at the WHO, I think they're going to see that the same way that Dr. Giroir saw it at HHS when he did an extensive and comprehensive review. I think we're going to be in good shape at the WHO because once again, the FDA will be proven to be wrong on the science and wrong on the policy. So we're hopeful that they'll be receptive to that message.
Thanks for that, Mac. Also, I think Peter forwarded to you yesterday that RFP I had come across. The FDA is asking for proposals to conduct an investigation on a new drug study with kratom. Would that be, as far as FDA is concerned, could that be considered a nail in the coffin? Because of course, FDA regulations are if a substance is considered or approved as a drug, then it can't be used as a dietary ingredient.
So this is another example of where the FDA is trying to bypass the procedures for scheduling of substances under the Controlled Substances Act by using other regulatory tools. They've tried to do it with the import alert, not been very successful there. Now they're looking to create a situation where an IND is filed because that's required on any human study, which would be part of a human abuse potential study that they're asking for. And the question is, will they use that IND that's issued then to trigger the drug exclusion rule, which would ban kratom products from sale in the United States? This is a very thorny legal question. It is a threat to the American public to be able to have access legally to kratom. It would create a black market for kratom, which is rife with adulterated products, pose more dangers to the American people. And if this is the game that the FDA is really involved in, shame on them, because they are elevating the safety profile to do exactly what Dr. Giroir said would happen if you imposed a ban. And whether they do it under a scheduling, under the Drug Enforcement Administration, utilizing the Controlled Substances Act, or they try these devious methods to use other regulatory tools to enact a de facto ban, they're circumventing the intent of Congress. And we're hoping that Congress will step in and swat them down hard because they deserve it. This is a group that has been hostile to kratom only because of their regulatory agenda, not because of science. And until they wake up and see the science ought to dictate their policy, we're going to continue this fight, and we won't go silently into the night the way that they hope people will do because they bully us into a position where we have to yield. We are not going to yield. The consumers, the American Kratom Association represents the 10 to 15 million American consumers that are using kratom safely. The FDA ought to stick to their role, which is to make sure they're not adulterated or contaminated raw materials used in finished good products. They ought to take off the market any kratom marketer that is using an impermissible and illegal therapeutic claim, and stay out of the business of trying to regulate without the authority by using these devious bureaucratic tools in order to accomplish it.
Thank you very much, Mac.
Malcolm, thank you so much. Mac, those are the questions that we have. Any final thoughts before we end this briefing call?
I would just encourage everyone to look at the facts, not only of the science, but look to see how far out of touch the FDA is with the American people. When you see 50,000 plus comments in a compressed time period that they set that are telling them that they are wrong, and the majority of those comments say exactly that, then you would think that the FDA would respond to the American people. They ought to look at health policy that serves those people. They ought to look to the threat that is posed by their ridiculous position on kratom, and they ought to do what they should do, which is to regulate kratom products so that they are safely formulated and free from contaminants and adulterants, and therefore allow people to thrive, to improve their health, and save the lives of people that are using kratom successfully to wean off of drugs. When you look at the data that was published by the government that showed between 2019 and 20 that there was a 30% spike in drug overdose deaths, and you think about the potential that kratom could have with some of those people that would help them to have weaned off of those drugs, then shame on the FDA for their failure to be sensitive to a public health disaster that's occurring right under their eyes and under their regulatory review. They need to fix this problem, not get in the way of it.
Thank you very much, Mac. If anyone has any additional questions or would like to schedule an interview, you can contact me at pete@americankratom.org. Mac, thank you for joining us this morning. I'd like to thank everyone for also joining the call, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.